In this last part of Chapter 17, we're going to take a look at ventilation-perfusion matching and acid-base balance. Ventilation-perfusion coupling is also called ventilation-perfusion matching. What it's saying is that we want to match the ventilation or airflow in and out of the lungs with the perfusion or blood flow. So we want to make sure that the air and the blood are in the same place so we get good gas exchange. It's really important to know these next two things, so make sure you star these. The alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is going to be sensed by the smooth muscle around the pulmonary arterioles, and so that will cause them to vasoconstrict or vasodilate. And then the alveolar partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to be sensed by the smooth muscle around the bronchioles, and that will cause bronchoconstriction or bronchodilation. In ventilation-perfusion coupling, if the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is low, that will cause the pulmonary arterioles to vasoconstrict. And the reason that happens is because the body is saying, well, why would we want to bring blood to this alveolus if there's not very much oxygen to pick up? We might as well vasoconstrict, not go there, and let's take the blood somewhere else where there is more oxygen to pick up. If the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is high, then the blood vessels will vasodilate. And that's because the body sees that there's lots of oxygen there to pick up, so let's vasodilate and bring more blood into that alveolus, and then we can pick up more of that oxygen. And what's interesting about this is the exact opposite of what happens in the systemic arterioles in response to the tissue partial pressure of oxygen. So in the tissues, if the oxygen levels are low, that would actually cause vasodilation instead of vasoconstriction. So that's really different from what happens in the lungs. The lungs are just opposite of what happens in the tissues. And then if we look at the alveolar partial pressure of carbon dioxide, if that's low, that will cause bronchoconstriction because the alveolus wants to build up the CO2 levels back up to normal. So if you bronchoconstrict, you're not going to exhale the CO2 that's being dropped off, and that'll allow the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to build back up to normal. If the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high in the alveolus, that will cause bronchodilation. And that's because the alveolus wants to get rid of the extra CO2 and exhale more of that to get the CO2 back down to normal. So this slide is super important. Make sure you star this. I will put one of these questions on the exam, so make sure that you know what's going on in these. So let's explain these in the next picture. Let's look at the picture on the left first. So in this picture, ventilation is going to decrease in comparison to perfusion. So what we mean by that is that the airflow in and out of the alveolus decreases in comparison to the blood flow to the alveolus. So maybe we've got a mucus plug that has formed here. Maybe this patient has pneumonia or something. And so we're not getting air flowing in and out of the alveolus anymore. And that will cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to increase because you're not able to exhale that CO2 that keeps being dropped off by the blood. The partial pressure of oxygen will decrease because there's no fresh air that can come in to replace the oxygen that's leaving through the blood. The high partial pressure of carbon dioxide will stimulate the bronchioles to do bronchodilation, and hopefully we can dilate the bronchioles enough to get some fresh air in and exhale some of that stale air to try to decrease the CO2 back down to normal and increase the oxygen. The low oxygen levels will stimulate the pulmonary arterioles to vasoconstrict. And that's because the body sees that there's not a lot of oxygen to pick up in this alveolus, so why bring the blood there? So it's just going to constrict, cut off the blood flow to that alveolus, and send the blood elsewhere where there's more oxygen to pick up. And then in the other picture on the right, if perfusion decreases in comparison to ventilation, so this is blood flow is going to decrease to the alveolus in comparison to airflow in and out of the alveolus. So maybe we have a blood clot that has formed here in the pulmonary arteriole, and now we're blocking blood flow to the capillary bed around this alveolus. So if blood is not coming in, we're not going to be dropping off CO2, so CO2 levels will be low in the alveolus. And then also, we're not going to be taking away the oxygen because the blood is not flowing through here, so the oxygen levels will rise. And what we're going to do in response to this to try to get things back to normal is that because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, we want to try to get that back up again. So we're going to bronchoconstrict. And if we bronchoconstrict, that'll decrease the amount of fresh air that's coming in, and hopefully we can let that carbon dioxide build up back to normal. And then because the oxygen levels are high, that will cause the pulmonary arteriole to vasodilate. And hopefully we can get around this clot and start bringing in some blood, and that will help get the carbon dioxide and oxygen levels back to normal. And then this is just a nice flow chart that just shows ventilation-perfusion coupling. Acid-base balance is really important in the body. The body wants to maintain a blood pH around 7.4, and it can vary between 7.35 and 7.45, but if you get outside of that narrow range, that's going to cause a lot of problems and could kill you. The two systems that regulate blood pH are the respiratory system and the urinary system. So that would be really important to know for the exam. So the two systems that regulate blood pH are the respiratory system and the urinary system. It's not an endocrine system and nervous system like it is with most of the other systems. So it's really important to regulate the blood pH for a couple of reasons. So if the blood pH is too acidic, it's less than 7.35, we end up with a condition called acidosis. And unfortunately, the central nervous system, the neurons, do not work very well when the environment is too acidic. So they get depressed, and you actually will go into a coma. The neurons in the respiratory center will also stop working, you stop breathing, and then you die. And then the opposite end, if the blood pH is too high, if it's above 7.45, then that's called alkalosis. And the effect on the central nervous system, the neurons in the brain become hyperexcitable. And so that's going to cause things like seizures, muscle contractions, and it also will cause your diaphragm to just continually contract and it won't relax. And so then you can't breathe and then you die from that. And then the other important thing that happens when the blood pH is not in the normal range is that proteins in the body will also denature. And proteins have a lot of important functions in the body. They're enzymes, receptors, they're all kinds of things, and so that's going to kill you as well. In order to maintain a normal arterial blood pH of 7.4, the ratio of the bicarbonate ions to carbon dioxide must be 20:1. You don't need to memorize that ratio. But it's important to remember that the respiratory system is going to regulate the carbon dioxide levels, which that makes sense because you can either increase your respiration or decrease it, and that will affect the carbon dioxide levels. And then the kidneys are going to regulate the bicarbonate ion levels. So let's look at the respiratory system and acid-base balance. So it's going to regulate the blood pH by controlling the carbon dioxide levels. So if you increase the carbon dioxide levels, so maybe you hold your breath, or maybe you've taken too many opioids and you're breathing too slow and too shallow, what's going to happen to the pH? So if there's too much carbon dioxide, that will shove the reaction to the right and you end up making lots of hydrogen ions. And if you have lots of hydrogen ions, that's more acidic and that will decrease the pH. And then if the carbon dioxide levels are too low, so if you're hyperventilating, for example, you're breathing really fast and deep, then that's going to make the reaction go to the left. And if you're going to the left, notice that these hydrogen ions over here on the right, they disappear by the time you get over here on the left. So if you have less hydrogen ions, that's going to make it more basic or alkaline, and that will increase the pH. So you can see that by changing your breathing pattern and the depth of breathing, that can affect the carbon dioxide levels, which will affect the pH. There are several buffers in the body that are used to help regulate the blood pH. And buffers are really important because they stabilize the pH, because they can either remove hydrogen ions or release them as needed. So the bicarbonate ions that are in the blood, they're an important buffer. So they can easily combine with the hydrogen ions if there's too many and get rid of them by making the reaction go to the left. Or we could generate the bicarbonate ions and the hydrogen ions if there's not enough hydrogen ions. And then hemoglobin in the red blood cell also is a buffer. So remember the amino acids, the protein part of the hemoglobin, that can either bind to the hydrogen ions or release them. So that's another buffer system in the body. So those will just help stabilize the pH and keep it right around 7.4. There are some problems we can have with acid-base balance in patients. So there's 4 conditions that we can see. The first one is respiratory acidosis. It's called that because the problem is with the respiratory system, and we've got too much CO2 that is built up. And remember, if you have too much CO2, that will shift our reaction to the right, and we end up with too many hydrogen ions, which makes it too acidic, and therefore you get respiratory acidosis. So we could see this, for example, in a patient that took too many opioids. So that'll suppress the respiratory centers in the brainstem, and they're breathing too slow and too shallow to meet their needs. So they're not exhaling as much CO2 as they should. The respiratory alkalosis, this is just the opposite. So here we have a patient who's maybe hyperventilating. So they're breathing too much and exhaling way too much CO2. So alkalosis is caused by decreased carbon dioxide levels. So remember, when the carbon dioxide levels get too low, that's going to shift this reaction to the left, and we end up getting rid of too many hydrogen ions, which makes you too basic or alkaline, and that's the cause of respiratory alkalosis. The next two, metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis, are not caused by the respiratory system. So they're caused by things other than carbon dioxide building up or not having enough. So metabolic acidosis, a great example there that we talked about before, is diabetic ketoacidosis. So remember, we can see that in our type 1 diabetics that are not well regulated, and maybe they're not taking their insulin. So they're breaking down too much fat, which gets converted into the ketones, and the ketones are acidic. So that will cause metabolic acidosis. And then metabolic alkalosis, we've got other things besides carbon dioxide making us too basic or alkaline. An example might be maybe a person who is vomiting a lot. They're vomiting up all that stomach acid, and they're losing lots of hydrogen ions that way, and so they become too basic or alkaline. So whenever we have problems with the acid-base balance, the lungs and kidneys will try to help each other out. So in respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, the problem is the respiratory system is not working correctly. So the kidneys will jump in and try to help out, and they will either save hydrogen ions, for example, if they have respiratory alkalosis, or if they have respiratory acidosis, they will secrete the hydrogen ions and get rid of them in the urine and save the bicarbonate ions. And then if you have metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, both the lungs and the kidneys will be working together to try to get the blood pH back to the normal range. And as far as measuring things in patients, there's several ways that we can get an idea of what their blood pH is and their partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So one is we could stick them with a needle and actually run an arterial blood gas. So here we're using the radial artery, or you could also use the femoral artery in the leg, and you would actually get a blood sample from an artery instead of a vein. And you would run that on your machine, and you would get the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the artery. That's what the A is. And you could also get the partial pressure of oxygen in the artery and also the blood pH. So that is all important information to know, but it's pretty invasive to keep poking your patient with the needles. So we came up with some less invasive ways to give us an idea of what the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels are doing in the body. So one of those is the pulse oximeter. So I'm sure probably all of us have had this done at the doctor where they put this on your finger, and there's an infrared light that will shine through your finger, and there's a detector on the other side. And depending on how much light gets through, it's going to measure the oxygen saturation of the blood. So it looks at how much of the hemoglobin is saturated. So here on this readout, you can see that the oxygen saturation is 98%, which is normal. And then the pulse oximeters also will give your heart rate, which on this person it's 83. And then to measure the carbon dioxide, we can use a capnograph. So remember, capno is referring to carbon dioxide. So we'll use this when the patient is intubated. So here's their endotracheal tube. And then there's a little sensor here that we're going to hook onto the end of the endotracheal tube. And there's an infrared light there that will absorb carbon dioxide as it passes by, as it's exhaled from the patient. And that will display the carbon dioxide levels on the computer. And that'll give you an idea what the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide is in the blood, because the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide in the exhaled air is going to be very close to what it is in the blood.